Good afternoon and welcome to Chats with Jamie. I'm Jamie Franklin, curator at the Bennington Museum, and I am very pleased to be welcoming Ken Rush. Ken is an artist from up in the Danby, Vermont area. Actually, he splits his time between Danby and New York, but we'll get into that part a little bit more. So without any further ado, let's welcome Ken. Welcome, Ken.
Hi, Jamie.
Hi, Ken. How are you?
I'm very well considering the circumstances.
Yes, well, it's been a busy, complicated, and for many people difficult couple of months, which is one of the reasons that we've been making this series, because I thought it would be a great idea to check in with artists and as well as historians and other people to kind of see how they've been thinking through kind of this complicated time, but also just to introduce artists from the area to the larger museum audience. So why don't we just begin by having you kind of introduce yourself and kind of, your background as an artist, how you came to your art making practice, and kind of maybe your connection here to Vermont. As I mentioned in the introduction, you kind of split your time between New York City and Southern Vermont. So just kind of introduce yourself and let us learn a little bit more about you.
Yeah, I am, as Jamie said, I'm Ken Rush, and I first came to Vermont to go to summer camp in 1956. I was 6, 7 years old, and simultaneously, I was introduced to a camp in Windsor, Vermont, and my biggest memory about that was making lanyards, milking the cow, which I did very poorly, and climbing on a hot afternoon Mount Ascutney. That same year, my parents actually bought a farm as a second home in Manchester, and that remains in the family. And we sort of have very deep Vermont roots in that way. I've been here every year during the summers now for 64 years, and in the 80s, my wife and I and our children began to spend all of our summers here, really in the Wilmington area, up above Bennington, and I would be able to paint. I used on location for painting. I would travel around from Reedsboro to North Adams, Massachusetts. I did a number of paintings, certainly in the Brattleboro area, and most particularly I ended up down in Bennington, where my brother lived. And in fact, his children went through all of the schools there, including Mount Anthony. My nephew lives in Bennington today with his wife. So if you ever run into a Jason Rush and Leanne, those would be the people. I came from a family where the visual arts were important, if a little bit on the side. I didn't realize really or understand the degree to which my mother was actually an artist, because her work was needlepoint. And these fantastic tapestries that she did my entire life were totally original. And many of them were scenic, Vermont. She was kind of a Grandma Moses in needle and thread. And some of these pieces are quite extraordinary. And also, I was familiar with painting because I used to observe when I learned how to play golf, when I was 10 years old, 11 years old up in Manchester, I used to see Luigi Lucioni paint under the birch trees at the 6th hole of the Aquatic Country Club. And I would approach him and I would just stare. And he had a wonderful little dog who was quite fierce and actually tried to take a bite out of me several times when I got too close. But he was wonderfully warm, and he would, without letting me distract him too much, he would ask certain questions. And in a funny way, the work of Luigi, I think, kind of found its way into my psyche as I became aware of my own artistic course.
I think you had mentioned that story to me, but I had forgotten that connection to Lucioni. That's really great. Kind of the landscape painter laureate of Vermont in many ways. So
Extraordinary. And I actually did not realize the breadth of the work that he did, nor did I recognize that when I first became familiar in my young 20s with the work of Rockwell Kent, that Rockwell Kent painted from Arlington, and one of the fields that he painted from is right above where my parents' home was. So in fact, in some of his views of Mount Equinox, you see some fields which I, 50 years after Rockwell Kent, would run through and play on and actually do some paintings in. So there's a lot of sort of weird coincidence going on there. When I was in boarding school in my 11th grade year, I had really a pivotal experience, and I discovered myself in the art room, and it was an experience of overwhelming recognition. I was a poor academic student, and I only liked fooling around in sports. And I got in the art room, and this wonderful mentor, Mark Potter, the American painter, sort of in the Andrew Wyeth tradition, looked at some of my work, and he proclaimed with enthusiasm, "Rush, you're an artist." Well, I was 16. That's all I needed. And in fact, that's really what determined my course. So from there, art school, followed by moving to Brooklyn to ply my trade at the age of 21, and finding out that I couldn't make a dime with my art, but I could continue to do it. And I actually fell into art teaching, and it became the other, besides my wife, passion of my life.
That's great. So why don't we actually bring up the first image that we have here to talk about? And it's one of the reasons that I actually reached out to you. You mentioned Rockwell Kent. I worked with a art historian, scholar, and collector, Jake Ween, on the Rockwell Kent in Vermont exhibition I curated back in 2012. And I believe it was Jake who told you to get in touch with me.
Yes.
And then I came up and visited your studio, I believe last year. It was about a year ago, I think.
Yes.
And this is the painting that you wanted to show me. And this is a painting of Tastee Freez right here in Bennington on North Street as you're headed north out of town towards Route 7. And it's kind of an iconic summer image. I was driving past this last weekend. I don't think they've opened up for the summer, but I've already been to the Arlington Dairy Bar. I think Billy T's is open already. But this painting is part of one of our current exhibition projects. So when we reopen on July 3rd, we're going to have an exhibition called People's Choice. And we've created, or rather our collections manager, Callie Raspuzzi, has created 26 different categories featuring anywhere from 4 to 6 pieces from the museum's collection. And yours is one of 4 or 5 street paintings, street scenes, paintings of Bennington streets. And so this would have been one of the paintings that you, as you mentioned, you moved here full time in the 80s, and this is from 1992. And it's just the sort of image that I think anybody who's lived in Bennington or spent summers in the area, it kind of has this kind of nostalgia attached to it. Can you just tell us a little bit about kind of this painting and how it came about?
Absolutely. This painting, and actually we were still are second homeowners. Our primary home is in Brooklyn, New York, and but we would be here for, frankly, almost 3 months every summer with the grace of the school vacations. And this painting I did on location. And so it's a plein air painting. And this is really sort of an important distinction because it's not a photorealistic painting, nor does it really look like one, but it's fairly detailed, and it has that kind of 60s, 50s iconic, nostalgic sort of feeling that we sometimes associate a good deal with the early photorealism of the 70s. But most of all, it's my version of Coney Island in Bennington. And I say that because at the time I did this, I had just finished a large series of paintings in Coney Island. And in fact, I had done a picture book for Macmillan Press for children, and it featured an old time Brooklyn seltzer man. So I was interested in all things food and all things sort of pop artish. This painting goes back to my earliest influences, very much of the great Edward Hopper, although it's got a little more sprightly mood. But Hopper has been an influence on me that I've never shaken, regardless of form. And it really tried to capture a particular time of day. I went down there each morning, probably over a week period. And on the right, you'll see my Dodge Caravan with a New York plate, that brown looking thing. And it was a 1984 Dodge Caravan, which was a great invention for an artist who had 2 children from his current marriage, and I had 2 children from my first marriage. So I was moving around with 6 of us in that caravan and my painting supplies and what have you. Many people have sort of said, well, what is it with the trash can? Well, the trash can was for me kind of like a iconic symbol. It was almost like the Venus of Willendorf or something. It had a certain Americanism to it, plastic, a particular shape. I never even really thought of it in terms of its iconography as a trash can. I really thought of it more as a form, just as in back of it, I think of those classical forms of the 2 natural gas tanks. I was down there just earlier, not this year, but last summer, and I took a photograph from this same location. And even the benches are still there. The lettering is pretty much precisely the same. The telephone poles, the trees are quite a bit bigger now, by the way. And the one thing that's changed is the model of trash can.
It's interesting. I think this would be a perfect kind of transition into this next image. So this is a much more recent image of yours of the Vermont landscape. A lot of your more recent landscapes are very much pared down to these kind of, as you use the term for the trash can and for the gas tanks, kind of iconic, but they're forms that you use very visually. Like Rockwell Kent, who really distilled his landscapes into their real core basic elements. You use these very tall vertical elements in the telephone poles, the kind of iconic structure of vernacular New England architecture, and then kind of the rolling hills and clouds of the landscape. So can you just tell us a little bit about the ideas that you've been kind of working through more recently with the Vermont landscape?
Absolutely. Actually, virtually all of my landscapes, with some recent exceptions, between 1998 and 2019 are conceptual. This is an example of a landscape which is created in the studio. There is no source except for what's inside of me. And of course, a lot of memory. I'm not working from photographs, absolutely not. Nor am I looking at a particular setting. This is the landscape which basically is embedded in my spirit. So in that way, it's quite different from the plein air experience of sitting in the parking lot of the diner or the Tastee Freez and absorbing the scene. This is the result of being in the studio. So in that way, I've always had the greatest admiration for the tradition of abstract American and European and any painters from anywhere actually, in which they are conjuring pure color, pure shape, pure form, in texture. I have never been able to shed subject matter. It's just not in me. I've tried. I have tried to work purely non-objectively. And it always comes back to a landscape. Now, some people look at Franz Klein, or they look at Helen Frankenthaler, or any number of non-objective artists, and they find landscape elements. But no, for me, the landscape is really what I'm seeped in. And there's no question, again, and I'm very happy to say that memories of Rockwell Kent exist in very much in these particular landscapes, just as I grew up on the edge on what they call Bentley Hill, which is the ridge next to Mount Equinox. So I grew up always looking at Mount Equinox. I think the large mountain on the left, for instance, in the distance, has very much either a Mount Equinox quality or in Arlington, so-called Red Mountain. These paintings evolved. This started out as quite a bright painting. And what you're really seeing is a painting which has also been very much glazed. So although I go in heavily with an impasto, with a palette knife, and I scrape the surface, as you can see, and this is like a 36 by 40 inch painting. So it's not small, it's not huge. And then I have of late been going in with thin glazes, very oily glazes. So, for example, if you look at the shadows on this sort of greenish mountain in the background, and if you look at the shadow in the foreground going across, those are umber and phthalocyanide, maybe a little alizarin crimson glazes that are quite thin and quite transparent, that have been put over the dry impasto paint underneath. So, for example, I bring that shadow in, and I like the way it gives it a sort of almost a 19th century look, although I hopefully feel like it's very much in a more contemporary tradition.
And another kind of reference point that you've already mentioned, which I think I can feel in this painting, and certainly in the next painting, which we'll look at. And why don't we actually just bring up that next painting? You mentioned Edward Hopper before, and this kind of brooding, dark isolation. A lot of you have lonely buildings that are very small and kind of overshadowed by the landscape. But this is actually a painting that you've been created, I think, just within the last few months, during this period of kind of social isolation that we've all been dealing with and experiencing in our own ways. And so why don't you tell us a little bit about this painting and more broadly what you've been working on over the last few months?
Now, this is a painting, one of probably a dozen that I have completed in Brooklyn, and I just brought up here, but I completed in Brooklyn during COVID. And I think of them as COVID landscapes. For example, and it came to me sort of from the oversaturation of watching the news, of no doubt being in a sort of semi disbelieving and at the same time anxious state. I spent way too many years reading dystopian novels, and suddenly to find myself living in one in Brooklyn, in this incredible isolation with my wife, my children and grandchildren 4 blocks away, but unable to see them except for from a distance. And I began to go back into the landscape, and this started absolutely as an abstract painting. It started with a few brushstrokes, very fast, done in a sort of expressionist view. And then as I worked at it, I realized this was the first. It's a 3 by 4 foot painting. I realized that it was the COVID curve, that somehow the landscape replicated that curve and the flattening of the curve that we seem to see from all sources in the media all day long. And so I with this particular one, I actually added my house. The house is an anonymous house. It's not necessarily an empty house. I don't know in fact, if it's occupied. I just think it's the symbolic house. Certainly one could be Freudian about it if one wanted to, but it's the subconscious house, if you will. It's the house of memory. And it's certainly the house which I glimpse as I move up Route 7 or move up the highway into New England. It could be a happy house, or it could be an extraordinarily empty and lonely one. Obviously, the influence of Hopper. And then on the other hand, on the formal hand, it's a triangle and a square. And it's a shape that I'm able to easily make with my I make them with the palette knife almost always initially, and then I go in with greater detail. The poles, Jamie, you mentioned, and the poles have been very important to me, and sometimes I've begun to kind of temper them down a little bit in my most recent work, but they always acted for me in the way that Mondrian's horizontals might act in a geometric abstraction, but at the same time with a psychological sort of alienation and a psychological, the poles represent both their isolation and at the same time the fact that they are connected, although I rarely do the wires. When I do the wires, I find that it becomes somehow too literal. So I let the mind do the wires, if you will. So this painting has a lot of what I like most about oil paint, pushing it around. I was actually surprised at how sort of menacing that mountain became, and yet how hopeful I thought maybe the sky might be, kind of like a Titian sky, if you will, or some Mannerist sky from the late Renaissance.
It's wonderful to just see how artists respond to moments like this, and the idea of that curve, which particularly early on in the pandemic we were seeing so much of. But also, I know the last painting we looked at, which was done last year before the pandemic hit, was a dark kind of broody atmosphere, and I know a lot of your paintings before then have been more bright, kind of blue skies, green landscapes. But this certainly has that kind of menacing quality. But I did think, the idea of the light starting to shine through, it's just the idea of how we can kind of project our emotions and our feelings and our kind of the complex issues that we're all dealing with. It really comes out beautifully in a painting that you wouldn't necessarily associate, a Vermont or abstracted New England landscape to be kind of commenting on, the issue of the pandemic. But in this painting, I think it really, you've hit the nail on the head. I just want to say thank you, and say thanks for sharing your work with us. Keep it up, and hopefully we'll be in touch soon once some of these socially distancing things start to become a little less necessary as we work through the pandemic. So thank you, Ken.
It is a pleasure for me, and I love the work that you're doing.
By the time this airs on Friday, the survey for People's Choice will be finishing up. So we'll find out if Tastee Freez makes it into People's Choice. And, fingers crossed, we'll maybe be able to talk to you again if it goes on the wall.
Awesome. Thanks, Jamie.
Thanks, Ken. Bye-bye.